Hey there, everybody. Here for my live stream today on Wednesday, January 15th, 2020. Karl Palachuk just had his own webinar at noon today, his SMB State of the Nation. So I'm going to dive in with some commentary and chat my way through what I thought of this. If you're interested in this, you can join me on the chat. I will be communicating via chat. You can catch on YouTube, on Facebook, or on Twitch. So let's dive in. Karl alluded at the beginning, he wasn't sure what I was going to think of some of the stuff, and as always, we agree on a bunch, but I got a couple points that I want to walk through and make some statements about, because I thought that was sort of he had some interesting ideas and such, and I wanted to elaborate on that. So I think it's worth diving in. Let's start with a discussion around the financials. Karl made a prediction about the fact that the market, the Dow, is in a pretty good place, and it's been growing and growing, and that a correction is due. Well, let me state my opinion here, and I want to do that with some data. Let's dive into some of the data here, because Karl is saying that things are going to change at some point, but he isn't sure when. I'm a little bit more sure. Experts are pretty pessimistic about the economy. If you look at where most of the major economic theories are coming from and statements around this, when you poll 1,700 business experts, they aren't particularly optimistic about things. They're kind of looking from a global perspective that there is a downturn coming. So while Karl's coming out saying that he's sort of saying keep on keeping on, I'm warning to batten down the hatches a little bit more. I think that this is distinctly a time to be thinking about how you're going to weather the storm, because it's coming, and I think it's coming in 2020. I'm pretty comfortable saying that I think that this isn't going to be good. Whether or not I want to call it a full-on recession, and by the way, I am no economic expert, and I do not give financial advice for a living, but I do business projections. I don't think this is going to be a particularly great market year. And so I would rather play it safe here and say I think it's going to be a bad year. But by the way, I'm not the only one who thinks this. I'm not the only person who's thinking that there's a problem. If you actually caught my podcast that dropped yesterday afternoon, Microsoft's CEO is also concerned about the broad economic growth and the technological process being linked. He's diving into some economic data that comes out of a economic expert, Robert Gordon, who's arguing that the digital revolution is not acting as a catalyst for growth across industries, despite what technologists want. I'm placing bets here myself. I think that when we kind of look into all of the things that we've going for, we're not going to see the kind of massive surge, and we've got a bad looking time, and we're due for a correction. I think all of these are leading to a more unstable state. So Karl's prediction is that it is coming. I'm going to be bolder and say that I think it's coming this year. And I can also say this from two perspectives. First off, I think it's coming, and I think it will happen. So 2020 is going to be the year of this. I think we need to project for that. But if I'm wrong, it's not a bad thing, because if you can weather the bad times, you can weather the good. There's links in my show notes from yesterday. If you didn't catch it, this is an interesting article, because it compares some of the performance around the Industrial Revolution to the technological revolution, and we're not seeing the same sort of broad growth. There's foundational issues that over the next 50 years, we've got an aging population, inequality, and debt. But those innovations aren't acting as a catalyst for growth across all industries. So I think this is a time to kind of batten down the hatches a little bit. So I think that's my first bit. So Karl, you're right. The economic outlook is uneasy, but I'm going to be bolder and say it's not great now. Now, let's move on to his next bit. Karl had a discussion around he had a bit of a comment around hardware. Karl made the comment that that he wants you to be focused on services and not reliant on hardware. I think he's right. I definitely think he's right. But I also want to dig into that market a little bit more. So let's go ahead. I've got some data here ready to show you. There we go. All the cool techno gizmos on a live stream, huh? I hope you guys are enjoying the ability to actually show stuff off, show me, and show you my data all at the same time. Really trying to step up my professionalism on the way we present data here. I have vowed not to sit on another webinar if I can avoid that. I'd rather you guys actually have the more of the streaming experience. So this also from yesterday, it's timeliness that we were talking about this. Gartner and IDC are both made some announcements about the PC market having its first year of growth since 2011. Again, I covered this on the Business of Tech for yesterday. I'm going to elaborate a little bit now. During the fourth quarter of 2019, there was an increase of 2.3% compared to the same quarter in 2018. In fact, the year was pretty good. The whole year last year was pretty good. They're pointing to Windows 7 support and the end of Windows 7, which, by the way, did happen yesterday. If you've not taken advantage of that, there are still roughly 32% of PCs out there with running Windows 7. Karl warned you off from relying on hardware. I am making another statement here. This is a mature market. That the PC market is mature. You should not expect growth here. And I don't expect a lot from the perspective of shrinking either. I think that is reliable, but he's right to say don't rely on that from a profitability perspective. By the way, close out that Windows 7 business. The fact that there's 32% of PCs still out there running Windows 7 and there's not going to be any updates for it, please go out and close that business. I can't believe that the numbers are as high as they are. There's some stats that I'll be probably talking about in the next day or two, which even shows it across Europe. If you want to get some of the opportunity breakdowns, for those of you that may be listening from overseas, there's all kinds of countries that are still doing a ton from that perspective. So I want to warn you again from a hardware perspective. Don't rely on it. It is stable. Will be a component of what we do, but it is not going to be a component that you can say is growth, nor something that you should be focused on from a profitability perspective. All right, let me talk on a trend that I think is important this year that Karl didn't touch on. So Karl didn't talk about regulation. Karl didn't really bring up some of the stuff that I think is going to be critically important from this year's perspective. There are a ton of things happening from a regulation perspective, particularly in the US, as we're going to be catching up with a lot of our European colleagues. GDPR is a reality for anybody that listens in Europe or is catching it from there. But California on the first of this year passed its new privacy law. That's the first of many to come. We're going to see rounds of changes happen from business perspective as that gets implemented. We're expecting the California AG to start enforcing that in the summer, and we'll get a good sense of that opportunity. There's going to be more to come. On this evening's podcast that drops today at 5 p.m. I'm going to cover some of what's going on between Google and Oracle because they have now filed briefs in the Supreme Court. We're going to see that play out over some arguments there. Sonos has taken on Google in the court as well. And additionally, you probably saw the rulings from Apple or the sparring between AG Barr and Apple. I think this is the year that some of that starts happening. You're seeing it in the election cycle. I'm not going to go political here, but I do think politics matters in terms of what's happening. The conversation around big tech is influencing the elections. Both sides have made statements around here. I think that there is a lot of opportunity here for you to work with your customers. I'm going to do a webinar next month with the folks at Channel Futures talking about how to position yourself around ethics and privacy as a competitive advantage. But I think companies that start taking advantage of having these conversations at a different level are going to really make a difference, and they're going to actually be able to stand out. But regulation's going to be a big deal this year. There's going to be real regulations that come at a next level. We're going to have conversations about data privacy, and the ongoing onslaught around security is going to be ongoing. So, Karl, I think you missed this one in terms of talking about things to talk about from a regulation perspective. So I thought that was kind of critically important, and I think something that we are going to want to talk about as we go into next year. Now, the big thing that he closed with was the opportunity around mergers and acquisitions, and I think he's right, and I want to talk about M&A a little bit to give you some perspective on what I'm seeing in terms of this space. Now, I want to talk about M&A because it's one of those things that I think gets misunderstood a lot. Karl's right. There's a lot of chaos that happens during an M&A process. And one of his questions that came in the webinar was, isn't this more on the vendor side? So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about it in general. Then I'm going to break it down on the vendor side and what I think on the solution provider side as well. I think you really need to understand when you think about M&A, where companies are in their financing cycle. I think this is really what matters, is that because this is not new stuff. This graphic that I'm pulling is from Wikipedia. And this is actually, you can think about businesses where they are from a financing perspective. Ultimately, from a company strategy perspective, I'm looking at two things to analyze. The first is the company leadership. What do they do, and who are their people, and what is their background, and what their thinking is? Because that'll give me a lot of sense. Give you the greatest example of them all that everyone is tracking on. Amazon's HQ2. We knew where Amazon's HQ2 was the moment they started it because you could look to Jeff Bezos. Where did he own property? He owned property in New York and DC and Seattle. He already had offices in Seattle. He's not going to get another one. Where does he want to spend 3 more months of his life? It's either DC or New York. That's what they announced. And then New York made their changes, and DC's the winner. That was predictable. That's the first thing you can think about. The second is you think about companies on their financing journey. Over on the left-hand side there, when you're starting your business out, revenue is low, and you're initially starting out on time. You're the founders, you're getting started. As you move up in revenue and in time, you're going to be growing your business and backed by a certain group of people. In the beginning, it's the co-founders. It's the founders themselves who are trying to get that business to the next stage. Then they move into the acceleration phase where they've got angels that are trying to get the return on their investment. They're generally smaller investments. Then you move into VCs, acquisitions, mergers, and strategic alliances, either early stage or late stage, as they move toward a public market. You don't have to move to the public market, but generally you do. Now, somebody asked about the vendor side of things, so I'm going to go ahead and put some of our favorite RMM vendors onto this graph and give you a sense. You can predict what they're looking for based on their stage. You can see that when I look about this from the smaller guys that are privately financed, something like Synchro or Ninja, those guys are the co-founder stage or the accelerant stage. They've not necessarily taken big VC money. So we know what they're motivated by. They're trying to get that business to the right level of revenue over time. As they move into being acquiring other companies, moving beyond, they're going to the importance of that orange line, secondary offerings, is what becomes important to them. That's why they start buying other things to add things to sell to you. Their secondary offerings become more and more important over time. This is predictable. You can totally anticipate this as it grows. That's the way that it's going to go. So anybody says that you can't that this is all chaos, it's not. You totally can understand what's going on. Now, think about that from an M&A on the solution provider perspective. We pull the vendors back off. They, again, are completely predictable because they're going to be moving from that co-founder stage into acceleration stages and maybe into the first or second rounds of acquisition. They're going to be looking to build either secondary markets by moving into new territories or secondary offerings. Now, that's what I think. So Karl was talking a lot around the size of the vendor or the size of the solution provider as the piece that you can do. I think he's right, but there's a subtlety that by lumping in size. I think it's much more important to focus on financial incentive as they grow. You can get a big solution provider who's still completely co-founder driven or founder driven, and so may continue to invest in that personal front. As you move toward having additional investment money, you're going to be thinking about optimizing that and adding secondary offerings. So for me, that's the thinking. That's the subtlety to that I think I wanted to call out. He's totally right. Those that are engaging and thinking about this from a very disciplined perspective and that are worrying about good customer service are going to do really well. His example and discussion around thinking about tickets and not pushing that off onto the customer is important. But I want to point out that you can do that at a large company perspective. Think about the companies that you engage with who do take a very personalized approach to service. If you call them up and then they will make sure that they're engaging personally and they've built a customer service experience around that, they tend to be associated with luxury brands, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. They've built full concierge. So don't necessarily assume size is the right thing. He's totally right on the trend. I just think the subtlety is to think about their financial motivation and where they're going to. I really hope this has been helpful. This is good fun to do. I appreciated the opportunity to follow up a little bit. Follow me on all of the various social platforms if you'd like more of this kind of analysis. We're doing live streams on a pretty regular basis, coming at you with some additional information to give you that kind of stuff, a kind of insight into where the market is going. I think that's some of the value of doing it in this format. For those that aren't familiar, I do a daily podcast called The Business of Tech. The Business of Tech is 5 minutes. It's designed to give you insight into to 2 or 3 stories and why you care about them as a technology services provider. You can find it at mspradio.com and on your favorite podcatcher. Really easy to consume. It's bringing you stories you may not have heard of in a traditional services press and giving you some insight into why you care. Please go ahead and sign up. We also do a weekly newsletter on Mondays coming out with some of the stories and summaries that you can get from MSP Radio, and look for those that start subscribing and following our stuff, additional new content coming in the coming weeks. It's an exciting time to be in this space. I think there's lots of opportunity, but it's going to be quite a year. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. Looking forward to some of the ongoing conversation. I'll follow up with people on social media as well. And thanks for joining me.